Welcome to the Green Urbanist Podcast, the podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross.
I'm working on ITS from a governance perspective this time around, not from an engineering perspective. Just to paint a clearer picture, a city generates so much data, and this data can be used to add value and to create new systems and services. And using this data, you can really optimize your whole transport ecosystem. But to do this effectively, you need certain governance frameworks to govern the thousands of hardwares and softwares that are required to operate your city. And this technology is invisible, but it's everywhere, and it enables all our urban systems and services, whether we're talking about traffic lights, bus systems, all the apps that you use to get around. There's a lot of technology behind the scene that we take for granted. And so cities, ideally, they need frameworks, and these frameworks should be designed in a way that encourages and facilitates data sharing, interoperability, and integration of all this hardware and software. And if a city does that, they can easily scale and scope this technology in a way that allows for innovation. And what's happening in emerging cities is many emerging cities like Phnom Penh and many others are at a risk of developing closed ITS systems. So these are ITS systems that are gently imposed on them by a foreign entity. I'm not going to point any fingers, but it is happening around the world, where you have a foreign company, often backed by their government, who come to a city and they propose to develop, say, a traffic control center. So these I don't know how to describe them, these James Bond looking rooms full of screens where you can sort of monitor and see exactly what's happening everywhere in the city, that plugs into all the cameras, all the sensors. So you'll have a foreign company come in and say, hey, we can build you a traffic control center and give you loads of cameras, and you'll be able to do this, this, and this. These projects are multi-million-dollar projects. They're huge projects, and they're being offered for free. And basically in this center, you have all this hardware and software come together into one centralized platform. And this allows for central operations of the transport system, which is great. But the way it's done by these big companies is they are often companies with a very wide portfolio of ITS solutions. So they might have the platform for the control center, the CCTV cameras, the street sensors. They will have this broad portfolio that plugs into their system, but doesn't plug into any other system, and no one else can plug into their system. So by working with them, you end up in a situation which is known as vendor lock-in, where you can only work with one vendor and they can charge you whatever they want to keep building on the system that they brought in for either very cheap or for free, which is obviously quite problematic. There's very much strings attached with many of these projects. And this is unfortunate because it can hamper a lot of local innovation. So say this happens in Phnom Penh, and I'm not saying it is, it could happen here or any of the other cities in Southeast Asia where a control center like this is built. And then you have a local startup build a great solution that is perfectly tailored for the mobility needs, which are very unique in Cambodia. And they want to make it part of the operation control center where a lot of transport is managed, but they can't because the system is closed. So as part of our project, we advocate for creating open systems that allow for the sharing of data between different hardware and software, regardless of the manufacturer. So we're agnostic in that sense. We can interoperate and we can integrate. And if you do that, it may cost you more upfront, and it can be a bit more of a headache, but it creates that extra flexibility, and it future-proofs your platform, which is, again, very important. So that's what we do in a governance sense. Another ITS topic we're developing is that of modeling and simulation. We recently formed a partnership with PTV Asia Pacific, which is a subsidiary of PTV Group. The first company I ever worked for, I spoke about them in the first podcast. It's a German company that develops these 3D modeling tools where you can sort of create a digital replica of what's happening in the real world in this virtual environment and say, test the impact of adding a BRT lane or adding a cycle lane, all in a virtual environment at a much lower cost than obviously running a real pilot or developing a real project, which is quite fun. And we're working with them and trying to navigate the challenges of calibrating a tool really developed for German cities, European cities, the Western world, trying to calibrate a model for a very different mobility system where driving is far less organized. And the vehicle composition is also very different. Cambodia, we have 75% of the vehicles are two-wheelers.
Oh, right. Scooters, motorbikes.
Yeah, that move more like a shoal of fish than a car.
not calmly staying in lanes going forward. They're sort of weaving around and...
Oh, absolutely not.
That must be incredibly complex to try and model then, because you have to tell the model exactly how to behave, don't you?
Yeah. So we're still in the very early stages of this. This is planned for the next 3 years. But basically in the software, you have to switch off the lane abiding behavior, whereby motorbike who's driving faster will overtake on whichever side.
Okay.
And then when it comes to traffic lights, here on the ground, I have never counted. I would like to, but I'd say about 8 to 15% run red lights. It's completely normalized. If you can see that there's no policemen waiting on the other side of the junction, you go for it. So it's quite different. Yeah,
so different.
And that also has to be, well, in theory, it should be factored in the model if you want to make it realistic. You know, many city governments prefer not to admit that that's the reality on the ground.
There's a saying or a quote, I can't remember who said this, but they said, all models are inaccurate, but some are useful.
Something along those lines. Obviously, they're very much an approximation of reality. They have a lot of weaknesses. But what is the alternative? So we have to work with what we have. But at the end of the day, this is a scientifically valid and very powerful tool developed by engineers for engineers. So that explains the the 1990s graphics. Thanks for listening in. This was an extract from my most recent podcast appearance on the Green Urbanist Podcast, where Ross and I had a fun flowing conversation about my life and work as an urban planner in Southeast Asia. You can go and watch the full-length podcast on my YouTube channel, or you can listen in by searching the Green Urbanist Podcast on all major podcasting platforms.